Hello, everyone. I'm Abebe Selassie, head of the IMF's African department, welcoming you to Africa Perspectives, where we discuss pressing economic policy issues faced by regional leaders. Today, I have the great pleasure of welcoming Professor Atif Mian, a distinguished economist and leading expert in the interaction between finance, the economy, and society. With a stellar academic background, including a PhD in economics from MIT, Professor Mian has taught at esteemed institutions such as UC Berkeley and the University of Chicago Booth School of Business before joining Princeton University in 2012. Professor Mian's research delves into the intricate connections that shape the economy with a focus on the intersection of finance and macroeconomics. He believes in the power of economics to foster collective outcomes that surpass individual contributions. His innovative approach and multidimensional insights have earned him widespread recognition in the field. In 2007, Professor Mian co-founded the Center for Economic Research in Pakistan, a non-profit institute dedicated to advancing economic knowledge and innovation. And he currently serves as the director of the Julius Grabunowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance at Princeton, where his research explores the implications of rising inequality for various aspects of macroeconomic policy, including growth, macro, financial markets, monetary policy, and fiscal policy. His influential book, House of Debt, co-authored with Amir Sufi, argues that an excessive debt buildup of household debt followed by a large drop in household spending, were the main force behind the major financial crisis, including the global depression and the global financial crisis. This seminal work has garnered acclaim from scholars, policymakers, and the wider public, establishing Professor Mian as a thought leader in economics. In 2014, he was predicted to be one of the 25 young economists likely to shape the world's thinking about the global economy, a forecast that clearly has proved correct because it was made by the IMF. Atif, welcome to Africa Perspectives.
Thank you very much, Abebe. It's a pleasure to be here.
Really, I'm very excited to have you here today. And you, I'm finding out, have very deep connections with Africa, including being born in Kaduna, Nigeria.
That's right.
But more importantly, for me, and this is a little bit of a passion of mine, in believing that this century will indeed be the African century.
Yes, of course. You know, we were just chatting before this event, and as you mentioned, post 2030, it is predicted that 1 out of every 2 individuals joining the labor force will be from Africa. So that tells you what is happening in Africa relative to the rest of the world. That while many parts of the world are contracting demographically, Africa is the one that is going to be the source of growth and resources for the rest of the world. So that presents a great opportunity, not just for Africa, but for the entire world, which also makes it, in my opinion, one of the most important global macro policy question, which is how can we make sure that Africa gets it right going forward in terms of its economic policy decisions, so that this big opportunity gets materialized in the most productive manner possible. And that's what really excites me to think about Africa and African issues.
Absolutely, which is why we have you here today. Of course, this is, as you said, like incredible opportunity, and this opportunity will not materialize unless we get many things right. And as advisors to policymakers, I think we have somewhat of an important role to play. So our focus will be very, macro financial issues, but of course there are broader political economy type issues that will be important, that need to be addressed. That will be important to lay the grounds for macro financial, getting the macro financial policies right. Maybe just to put that aside, we can start on these political economy issues. To what extent is the short-termism that we often see in macro financial policies a function of problematic political issues, not having a strong social contract, the political instability that prevails in many African countries and elsewhere in the developing world. So, which way does the causality run is the first question I want to ask.
Well, the causality for sure runs both ways, which is to say short-termism makes the macro situation more fragile, less sort of durable, and which in turn makes the political environment more fragile and hence creates more incentives to be short-term because people don't know how long they're going to remain in power and things of that nature. So it goes back and forth, which is why it's very important to be aware of this and to put in guardrails and institutions that promote on the margin longer-term thinking. And we know there are many ways to do that. So just to give you one example, if you think of the evolution of central banks and monetary authorities, part of the rationale behind that was exactly what you're pointing out here, which is that even the developed world was facing this tension that you have this tendency to print money because you want to win the next election. So the people collectively said, well, I know that I will not be able to control myself when I get to power, so let me ex ante agree to an institutional arrangement where we voluntarily cede some of the authority to an independent organization, which we will call the central bank, the monetary authority. And so they are the ones making this important decision of how to run monetary policy, independent of the political cycles, right? And I'm just giving that as an example because I feel we need more institutional thinking like that. Now, obviously, it's a very careful and important question because you don't want to, we all believe in liberal democratic principles, so you want to give people a voice and so on. But I think there is a way to balance the two where the people have a voice in terms of how these institutions are run and so on. But while these institutions are running, they are pushing back on some of the myopic tendencies of the political process. I hope we get a chance to talk about what that might mean in the context of Africa. But it is front and center. And something we have to be very, very proactive about in design. No, we can't just say, Abebe, let's go and do X, Y, and Z. We have to be careful about the political process and how feasible or implementable X, Y, Z is.
Absolutely. So I definitely an issue I want to come to. Maybe starting with kind of the question that at the moment is exercising quite a lot of policymakers in the region, which is we're in an environment of quite a constrained financing, particularly from the global financial markets, and this is true for many developing countries, but acutely so for sub-Saharan Africa. Now, there is this long-standing perception that capital inflows are necessary part of, are one of the main constraints for development. Not having enough resources to invest in health, education, infrastructure is the main constraint, and of course something which the theory also supports, including a lot of the work of the late Bob Lucas. So question I have for you is that you have a view which is a little bit different, that you have this tendency, you believe that this is not always the case. Maybe if you could elaborate on that to kick us off.
Yeah, no, that's a super important question. And it's not just that I have a theory. I'm more guided by data and by empirics. And when one looks at the last 40 years, the picture I see emerge is one where countries have to be, and when I say countries, I want to be very careful. I don't mean countries like the US and Europe, not the advanced. For them, the world is different. Countries like the developing countries, many of the African countries fall in that category. For them, the role and the implication of global finance is very different from the role and implication of global finance for countries like the US and Europe. And that asymmetry, there are very real reasons for why that asymmetry exists. It has to do with the financial development in their own respective countries, the kind of institutions they have to withstand the global whiplashes like the one we are seeing today when interest rates start to rise and so on and so forth. So it's very important to understand that system before we think about the right and the appropriate domestic policies for those countries. So I think that's sort of a very important point. But let's take a step back and first think about growth and the process of development a bit more holistically, and then we'll come back to the financing question. Because you can't talk about the financing question without first talking about, okay, where does growth come from? And the first most important thing to realize about growth is that it's a function of one variable by and large, and that is domestic productivity growth. So to grow, the first thing to focus on is not outwards in terms of financing needs. The very first thing to focus on is inward, and to ask yourself, what can we do to boost our domestic productivity? Like, that's the engine for growth. So we need to prioritize things properly. And I sometimes have a feeling that when people talk too much about financing needs, and especially external financing needs, it sort of gives the wrong impression that the only thing missing is a pot of money that is not coming into your country. And if you could only bring in a sufficiently large enough pot of money into the country from the outside, all of our problems will go away. And any tendency to go in that direction is completely wrong, because money will naturally flow, first of all, if it is finding the domestic ingredients in terms of rule of law, in terms of the human capital, in terms of the complexity of the domestic institutions, the firms, their organizational capacity, the level of management. Those are the actual ingredients that go into promoting growth. So I just want to, I think the first thing is, and it's true for Africa, it's been true for all other countries in Asia and so on, that if you want to grow, you first look inward, you first focus on building your domestic infrastructure in the wider sense of the word. So it's Africa and Africans that will lead to growth for Africa. Now, there is an important role about the rest of the world and global finance, but it's very important that we understand that it's a two-edged sword. That's very important. And I think that's the other piece that gets missed in this conversation, which is people just talk about what global finance can do for us in a positive way, without talking about the other edge of this sword, which is that it can hurt us. So let's talk about that first, actually, because I think what that means is, what it basically tells us, and I want to go in that direction in terms of our conversation today, what it tells us is that because global finance is a two-edged sword, you must design appropriate set of rules and institutions domestically to be able to harness the positive and protect from the negative. It's very important that you have that frame of reference, because otherwise you'll end up making big mistakes. Like we have seen countries make Ghana is a country with so much potential, and it just literally hurts to think of what has recently happened in Ghana, a country with so much potential, a country that had peaceful transition of power successfully, vibrancy. People are able to live with each other with varying beliefs and all that. It's bursting with potential. And just because it could not understand well that negative edge of this sword, they've ended up in default and all kinds of trouble. So I think that's why I feel like it's very important to understand that.
So, if I could just unpack that a little bit. I completely agree, first of all, on the point that you made about African policymakers, African governments having agency and the need to focus on domestic reforms. Absolutely. So, question and relating it to the point that you made about external financial flows. My point is exactly this issue that first, it's going to be country-specific, what kind of policy reforms you want to focus on. But there's this broader sense in our countries, in developing countries, that the structures are not adequate. The structures do not seem sufficient to allow countries to live in a restrained manner vis-a-vis external finance. And it's a very difficult question, and I think, again, the issues vary from country to country, but this is something that I've often kind of have been thinking about and not appreciating. Do you have any thoughts from outside, perhaps, about how this short-termism emerges, and maybe this is a good way to segue to what the guardrails we need to be thinking about
Yes.
in terms of preventing that are?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think it's like, I like the sort of the Socratic method of understanding these issues, because I think if we look at the evidence over the last 40 years, at least in my mind, it's sort of automatic. The answers come about themselves in terms of what countries need to do. So let me talk a bit about sort of what the broader evidence from the last 40 years suggests. What is interesting about the last 40 years is that this is also a period of what we can call as rapid convergent growth. We have seen countries like China and Korea and before them Japan post-World War, grow incredibly quickly to catch up to like the leading. And so, there's a lot of, success stories for us that we can look back on. At the same time, this is also a period where we have seen this incredible growth in global finance. Mm-hmm. So credit to GDP, if you look at cross-border capital flows, no matter how you measure it, there's been a big. Now, you might think the two are related. That is this rise in global finance that has led to, in a causal sense, this growth in the successful stories like China and so on. But that would be wrong. There's actually no correlation between the two, and that's very important to understand. In fact, if you look at specific cases, like take China, which is a huge, obviously, success story, China grew at the pace that it did without really relying on global finance by and large. In fact, we were talking about external financing needs. China is a country that proved the opposite. While it was growing as fast as it did, it was actually lending to the rest of the world by generating huge current account surpluses. So I think we need to understand why that happened and why many of the successful stories actually go against this broader view that you need external. I think there are real reasons why countries like China actually they understood at an intuitive level that it's a two-edged sword and we need to protect ourselves from the negative edge as well, and we need to understand that. So if you look at data more carefully, and I have an ongoing project with Abhijit Banerjee where we are doing that, there are a few broad facts that emerge that I want to highlight. The very first fact is that countries, going back to your question about myopia and short-term thinking, countries that end up being more volatile, that have greater macroeconomic volatility measured in terms of standard deviation of GDP growth. Sorry to bring in technical jargon here. With more short-term volatility, in the longer run, they grow less. Mm-hmm. So there is a negative correlation precisely that your question is about. Now, what is interesting, however, is that when you decompose where that volatility is coming from, that is generating this negative relationship with growth, it turns out that it is one factor over all others that is responsible for that negative correlation, and that is, it is countries that are more volatile because of their exposure to the global financial cycle, that they go up and down with the global. It is that volatility. It's countries that are able to protect themselves from that global volatility end up growing faster, and countries that don't, like we are seeing today, Zambia, Ghana, Pakistan, countries that are unable to protect themselves from the whiplashes of the global financial cycle, it is precisely those countries that in the long run, over this 40-year period, grow a lot less. So that's fact number one. Fact number two, and maybe this goes back to the famous Bob Lucas intuition, we all know that we need financing or investment, real investment, putting in new property, plant, and equipment for growth. When you look at the data, it is unquestionably true that countries that invest more, they grow much faster. So again, that's the 40-year kind of very clear message that comes to us. However, we can decompose investment into the two ways you can invest. You can do domestic investment through your domestic saving, mm-hmm. or you can do domestic investment, build property, plant, equipment, blah, blah, blah. You can do that by borrowing externally, which you will do by running a negative current account balance. It turns out that while investment overall is hugely positive for growth, if you split in these two components, the entire positive loading is on domestic saving. In fact, the loading on borrowing externally is negative, precisely in line with the China example that I was giving up. So that's a broader fact about the last 40 years across all developing economies. And so we can say we need net external financing, but these are facts. Reality is that investment finance on average. So we need to understand what's going on and how to make sense of it. The last fact I'll give, and then we'll move on to, what it all means, is that these two main facts, that exposure to global financial cycle on the volatility side and financing your investment externally, both have negative consequences. These facts are primarily developing country facts. These this is not true for OECD economies, which is to say the world is different. To live like a developing country is different. The experience is fundamentally different than the experience of a developed, established, a country with established institutions and markets. And there are very good theoretical reasons to believe that. We can get into those. But we need to understand that asymmetry before we jump. And there has been criticism for the right reasons, I think, when people talked about Washington consensus and things like that, because that was this idea that one size fits all. But there is this very important asymmetry that I'm highlighting here. And we need to recognize that before we move towards prescriptions and policy. So that's the framework, and then I'm happy to jump into the policy.
That's
side.
very helpful. Very helpful. Both of the empirics and kind of how you've come to this view that we have to be careful, and finance is a double-edged sword. So maybe we start by considering the first point that you made about capital flows, volatility that can have an impact on growth. There's a presumption in that kind of framing of the question that development progress in many African countries has perhaps not been as good as in places like China. So a question for you, which is, when I think about the progress in Africa, like say, from the late 80s, early 90s onward, I see tremendous progress. Not as much in the income divergence, so income convergence has been limited, but more on the development outcome dimension. I think it's just one of the undertold stories. Life expectancy, when I was back home in the early 90s working, was, I don't know, in Ethiopia, was 48, 47, 48. Now it's well above 70.
Yeah.
Infant mortality across the region, the extent to which it has declined. So there's been this, from the really, weak initial conditions, there's been this tremendous progress on social and human development outcomes, but not as much on the income dimension. So I just, an overall take, I would be grateful for. Do you see the last 30, 40 years as having been one of some success?
Yes.
Or, so what is,
no,
so
absolutely.
then that begs the question of why is it that we're so worried about financial globalization and the deepening and attendant effects it's had, including in places like Zambia and Ghana? Maybe this is a cyclical thing.
Yeah. Well, I think it's very important to maintain the right perspective, and you're absolutely right that we should not lose sight of the positives. By and large, we are living in the best of times ever, humanity-wise. And the big reason for that is not country XYZ or party XYZ, it's science.
Science. Absolutely.
That's it. That's it.
Absolutely.
So the big improvements in life expectancy and so on that you're talking about are basically there because not only does science continue to improve, but as it improves, it makes the critical life-saving drugs and so on, treatments, cheaper and cheaper. And it's that process that has continued to help the poorest of the world to, and that's a wonderful thing. It's something to celebrate and so on. What people like myself, what we are talking about is that the potential and the opportunities are even greater. And what we need to now do is that now that these individuals are living to closer to their full potential of 60, 70, 80 years, as they do that, we want to fulfill and enrich those lives with the kind of opportunities that we are able to experience in some of the more richer countries who have just been lucky or whatever. That's the way you want to think about it, of course. Let me now sort of come back to what that means for thinking about global finance and how we should think. I gave the average experiences, right? That on average, exposure to global financial cycle is negative. On average, funding your investment by borrowing from the rest of the world is dangerous, has negative implications. But let's try to now cut it further down. It's not all bad.
Yeah.
So let's try to understand. And I think that's what I meant by the positive or negative edge. And that then starts to define what your macro financial policy needs to be. So you can get to those sort of opportunities that we are talking about here. When you look at capital inflows and you start to bifurcate flows into different types and so on, I think there is again a very sort of typical picture starts to emerge. And I want to emphasize that so we can be more meaningful than saying all capital is bad and so on. And that's the following. If you borrow from the rest of the world, what it really matters what that borrowing and financing is doing domestically, number one. For example, if you are borrowing externally to finance the less productive, and my favorite example always is the non-tradable sectors in general and the real estate sector in particular. There's work. I have done some work with Amir Sufi and Emil Werner. Emil Werner has done work with Carsten Muller, and there's a broader picture that is emerging from this work that says, look, if you're borrowing from abroad, but you're borrowing to fund this non-tradable sector, you're going to have serious problems going forward. Now, conceptually, that makes a lot of sense. Now, when you bring theory into it, it's like, oh, of course. It's like the Socratic method. It's like, of course, when you look at it gives you the answer right away. The reason is that when you borrow from the rest of the world, the cost of that capital, the economic cost of that capital actually is much higher than whatever the interest rate you see on the paper. And the reason for that is the only way for you to pay back external borrowing is through your tradable sector. Because you have to be able to sell something more to the rest of the world so you can pay them, because they are not interested in your local non-tradable goods and services. They're not going to come and live in Addis Ababa or wherever. They want to enjoy that profit while sitting in New York or London. And so that's the reality. And so you have to be very careful. So now this is message number one. Already you can start to see. You have to be very careful that the capital that is coming in is not funding the non-tradable sector, but is funding the tradable, the more productive sector, number one. But we can then dive further into it. And it's not just about funding the tradable sector, it's also about what are you buying? If you really think of it deeper at a conceptual level, I think the situation starts to become much clearer. And what you start to realize something at a deeper level, which might sound quite radical at first when I say it, but I think it's true, which is developing countries, it's not that they lack capital, like parts of gold coming in. That's not what they lack. What they lack is certain kind of technology, perhaps, maybe a certain type of organizational capacity, maybe a certain type of managerial skill set. Those are the ingredients. Again, it goes back to what I started in the very beginning. Growth is about domestic productive capacity. What developing countries are lacking at times are aspects of those ingredients. It is those ingredients they need, not the foreign capital per se. The problem, however, is that those ingredients are not available domestically. So you're trying to import those ingredients, but the only way to import those ingredients is in the form of a joint venture, perhaps, where an external foreign multinational firm, for example, comes in. It obviously brings in the capital, but remember, the capital is an excuse. You have to remember that critical principle as a developing country policymaker. That capital is an excuse. It comes with the negative edge of the sword. What you're really trying to import is technology. What you're really trying to import is the know-how of those people and people with them. And so that gives you sort of this next insight, which is when you bring these people and technology and processes in, that's what you're really doing. You must do it in a way that as you bring them in, they stay inside Addis Ababa. They stay inside your countries, and not just stay, but they infect others. So others learn from it, and there is broader sort of a synergistic growth as a result of that you see other people learning from what they are doing, and they also start becoming more productive and more efficient. If that's how you do it, then, and it's in the right sectors, tradable and so on, you A, have gotten growth, B, you now can pay it back. That's basically it. But that's what you need to develop.
Fantastic points, and particularly like the point that you made about the cost of capital that you're importing is much higher than embodied or reflected in the interest rate that you're paying at the time that you're importing. But what I'm hearing from what you're saying, though, is something or what countries have been doing is something orthogonal to what you're saying.
Yes.
In the sense that, if we think about the big debt buildup, by tapping capital markets that happened by many emerging markets, including frontier markets in Africa, the rationale was that we're borrowing to invest in health, in education, even again, notably on infrastructure, because those were seen as the main blocks, the main constraints on growth. What you're saying is that that kind of borrowing has to be much, much more restrained than has been the case in recent years, and you have to be thinking more about financing things domestically.
Absolutely. And so now that question, that's a very important question, because that puts our focus on a complementary policy issue. Because you can say, okay, Atif, you're saying be very careful with external borrowing and so on. But then what do we do? We have all these health needs, we have all these education needs and so on. What do we do? So that is the next question, the obvious question, which is domestic resource mobilization. There is a huge need to raise domestic capital productively. That's what we mean by when we talk about building domestic capacity, building domestic financial capacity, financial development, domestic infrastructure. When we use domestic institution, when we use all these buzzwords, this is what it really means. It's very important for countries to think about why are we unable to build the extra hospital that we need. Because think about what goes into the building of a hospital. It's brick and mortar. All countries have, by and large, the ingredients that you are able to do that. So why are you not able to do it yourself, right? And I think when you think deeper about that question, it will force you to really come up with the right answers. Because it's always easy to say, knock on some external door, whether it's the World Bank, the IMF, or whatever, to say, well, can you please give me this? It's really, we'll have this shiny building at the end of the day as a result of that. But you have to understand that you might have the shiny building, but you're developing or building external liabilities. That's what borrowing means, whether it's an equity funded or a debt funded. It is external liability that is denominated in a foreign currency that is not yours. That is what we meant by a higher economic cost of that. So it is very important for these countries to understand that when we have these real investment needs, which are real, there's no doubt about it, there's no easy fix solution to it that you can knock on some bank's door and externally and do it. You must do it. So that puts the focus on developing the domestic banking sector, for example, mobilizing savings. And so for example, and then that is a very fascinating age. For example, you can now start to develop a pension system where you're doing two things at the same time. You're developing a pension system, but through the pension system, you're providing ways of providing patient long-term capital to your local domestic needs of all the sort that we are talking about, right? That's number one. Number two, on the public investment side, again, think of China. How did China finance this incredible infrastructure boom? It did that through land sales, one main, right? Now, that is basically a mechanism for funding, raising domestic capital by promising a shiny building or a shiny city, and people saying, yes, we believe in it. Here's our savings, go build it. And then they were able to build it. And it created a virtuous cycle. But that's what I mean by those are the examples of domestic resource mobilization, domestic capital raising, so that you do that and then you build real investment domestically. That's what the data tells us. That's why I started with that 40-year evidence, because I don't want people to take my word for it. That's what the data is really shouting at us, I would say. And the countries need to adopt those attitudes. I do believe, and maybe we can come to it at some point if we have time, I think when we talk about, as we are talking about, okay, clarifying what they need to do and so on and so forth, and you have very rightly from the get-go pointed towards political sort of constraints, the short-termism, myopia. And it's there everywhere. Yeah. Isn't it there in DC?
Oh, absolutely.
Of course, right? And so it's not that people are different one place or the other. The question is, how do you deal with those tendencies, your common communal tendencies? How do you do? I mean, that's a very serious question for any society, and you must react to that in a collective manner. So I hope we can talk at some point about sort of how we can develop some internal muscles on the policy institutional space so we can push back against those tendencies and at the same time build these kind of conversations that you and I are having to say, look, we need to have serious people, professionals, being involved in the decision-making process of how much to borrow, in what form to borrow externally. I'm just highlighting that it's a very sophisticated question.
Absolutely.
Please don't do it blindly.
Absolutely. No.
And don't ask the IMF, not that there's anything wrong with the IMF. Develop your own capacities to think about what's good for you, what's bad for you. I think we need to understand that we really need institutions like IMF to do this, to solve this global communal problem. I'm a big fan of institutions like the IMF. We need the United Nations and so on. But at the same time, we need to replicate this at the regional level and then at the country level. They need to develop their own institutions, their own thinking capacity to be able to make those decisions intelligently themselves.
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more on that point. And countries having agency, policymakers having agency, and needing to think anew about what's right, including advice from entities like us. And I think this is a good time to segue to the kind of ideas that you have, the mechanisms or agencies of restraint that governments can perhaps rely on to have the right type of macro financial policies, including in dealing with capital. But from what I'm hearing from you is how important it is to ideally avoid original sin. Inability to borrow the inability to borrow in your own national currency. I mean, to try and develop your financial markets. Point you laid out very nicely. But also, you're not quite arguing for financial autarky.
Of course
right?
not. Of course not.
You're talking what's from what China, Vietnam, and others have done. It's more about leaning against the hot money, portfolio type flows, relying a little bit more towards FDI type flows, and also, of course, quite a bit of restraint on fiscal policy, because often it's borrowing by government, which then kind of leads to the build-up of kind of investments in real estate, et cetera, that tend to happen. So what is it by way of mechanism that you would have in mind to have a desirable financial mix in a country? I mean, earlier we spoke about central banks. So central banks, we have a clear mandate to focus on inflation, and have done a fantastic job, including in the region, getting inflation, largely under control. Current global shock being an exception. What kind of mechanisms, what kind of specific policies would you advise policymakers to think about?
Well, first of all, I think you've laid out some of the ingredients and principles in what these institutions need to do and think about already. If you put some more structure on it. I think what these countries, first of all, they need to, what I would propose to be a bit more specific is that just like we have central banks and so on, these countries should, they can call them different things, whatever resonates better, but I think what they need is essentially a macro financial stability board or body, which is delegated some authority, again, along the principles of how central banks are done and so on, that maintains this balance of having a public voice. So, they are appointed by the usual way, staggered, long-term. Their appointment has a say of the people's representatives, but once they are selected, they are given some protection against the political whiplashes. It's made up of professionals. There are some criteria on who can be on this board and so on. That's what it means. I mean, that's what we mean by domestic instrument. Now, the next set of questions is, if you have that kind of a structure, what's the mandate? And how should that mandate be run? I think that's where we have already started to have a conversation on what that mandate is supposed to be. I think the broader mandate is exactly to say, look, help us, protect us from the wrong edge of this double-edged sword, and help us make the right decisions. So when it comes to major decisions of what kind of capital controls you need to have, what kind of borrowing, sovereign borrowing you need to do. Decisions of that sort, bigger decisions of that sort, need to run through this board for feedback, for consultation, for verdicts, and so on and so forth. Let me give you some examples. This will include, for example, a major issue over the last 20, 30 years, and you see that in countries like Ghana, Pakistan, and that I'm very well familiar with, is financing of energy. Mm-hmm. And there have been deals through IPPs, independent power producers, and so on, where through international financial mechanisms, countries have gone into financing of energy that frankly makes no sense from this perspective of what we just talked about. Because what you're doing is, if you look at the structure of this, it comes in financing with sovereign guarantees of pricing and things like that. But what all of that means is you're effectively borrowing energy from abroad in a foreign currency, and raises exactly the same question that I started off with. How are you going to pay it back? And the reality is you cannot, it's not sustainable, and that's why these IPP projects, they put so much pressure on balance of payments and so on, that it leads to currency crises, balance of payment, close to default, and all those situations that we have talked about. So you have to understand, so that's part of the original sin, if you will. And the sort of domestic thinking and institutions and this body that I'm proposing, it would think about those questions, and it will say, look, energy is a huge question and so on. We have needs, but how are we going to go about solving those needs? You have to do this with a surgical knife, not with a hammer. And solutions like the IPPs are trying to throw a hammer at a very important problem. But we need to put sophisticated people in charge of it. And I think in terms of how we can, this is where I think places like the IMF, universities, and so on, all well-meaning, we need to help think this through. But ultimately, these countries need to develop this domestic muscle power to be able to do it right. That's what China did. That's what Vietnam is doing, right? It's very interesting. Again, we are talking about where we are today. We are talking about the funding squeeze that you very rightly pointed out in African countries and elsewhere. And think of what Vietnam is doing right now. It's facing the global downturn. It relies on exports and so on. Interestingly, Vietnam is a country that right now is slashing its interest rates down to boost demand so that growth doesn't slow down. And the question is, how is it able to do that when everybody else is forced to tighten to defend their currency and so on and so forth? Because they were intelligent about the growth process. They put in, as you know very well, they put in those guardrails well in advance, protecting their domestic market from the global capital headwinds. And that gave them that space to run an independent domestic monetary policy, which is exactly now they're benefiting from that ex ante, putting in the right set of institutions and policies. It's a wonderful example. I love to see it, what they're doing. This is where, and it's a question of, again, it's not one size fits all. It's a very clear message that comes about that when you are the poorest, you are most careful on this dimension. And as you become richer, you can relax. And once you get to the OECD stage, you can let go of all constraints. That's perfectly fine. We can go to this utopia the benchmark model that we write down. You can go to that model. That's perfectly fine. But you have to graduate. You have to don't forget the initial steps of the ladder, or we'll fall straight on our feet. We'll fall on our faces.
Absolutely. I'm really want to unpack a little bit more the idea of this macro financial stability board. Right now, kind of, best practice, or like some countries have a setup where they have fiscal councils to advise on policy, fiscal policy, how it should be conducted, and of course central banks more on the monetary policy side. What you're proposing seems to be a little bit of a mix, an entity that would be thinking in a much more integrated way about how monetary and fiscal work, but also having a view on some of the more longer term sources of pressure on the balance of payments, the example you gave on energy. So, can you think of a country that has something like this? I was thinking, as you were laying this out, the UK, maybe the Office of Budget Responsibility that they have. Is that the kind of structure that you have in mind? And do you know of a country in a developing world, ideally, which already has an entity like this?
Yes, I do. And you're absolutely right. The countries have their own ways of having it in various forms. You gave the UK example. That's exactly right. Even in the US, we have the Congressional Budget Office. It doesn't have powers, but it's taken seriously. It has a voice. It has an implication. Many times when there are political disagreements, they will say, "Okay, we'll vote on this if the CBO score comes out right," and so on and so forth. And then see. So, of course, as the world becomes more polarized, it narrows the space for effective functioning of institutions like the CBO. But I think we have many examples of that, right? All the regulatory authorities and so on. Think again, we are sitting in DC and we don't have to go far. If you go back to the breakup of the big oil, the telecommunication companies and so on, that was done because there were regulatory bodies that were thinking along these questions in their domain. This was the IO domain, of course. But let me give you a specific example from a developing world, which I think is really, I really love sort of what they did, and it's the benefits are there, is Chile. So Chile is a country that obviously, copper and big reliance on natural resources, and as you know, is a big sort of, again, the two-edged sword with natural resources. You can really benefit from it, or you can do it really bad. And there's a big political question, when the copper price is high, the political party that is in would love to use all of that money, but when it drops, then the whole country kind of falls with it. So they suffered as a result of that, but then they eventually came to this collective realization that we need to have something of a board that controls how much you can spend out of these booms that you generate through copper. And so they put in place a very basic, simple structure, which is this, they have these sort of professionals who understand it, but then they literally put in place a rule, a spending rule, that says you have to smooth out the copper cycles. You have to smooth out the natural resource cycles. And whoever is in authority, they cannot just say, spend it all. We, the body, and this set of rules we have put in place constitutionally will constrain. So you willingly put constraints on yourself. That's the broader message. All smart countries do that. Not imposed by a foreigner. You impose it on yourself. So you own it. And so Chile is a wonderful example, I feel. I think it really needs to be studied. Andre Velasco, who was also the finance minister of Chile, he's written some nice articles on that because he was involved in that experience as well. I think we need to learn from those. I really think that's a wonderful example because people say, okay, it's happening in the US and so on, but I think it happens in, and again, even if you look at China, now obviously it's a very different country in terms of its structure and so on, but I think even if you look within China, it's very interesting that they put in those sort of deliberative processes domestically. So if you take, just to give you one example, because we were talking about what kind of capital, it's not just that China said we don't want to borrow, so financial autarky. No, they were smarter about it actually. So it's a very interesting study to think of their FDI policy and how it changed over time. So when they start opening up in the Deng Xiaoping era, they say, okay, we are opening up, and it's very interesting when there's the first kind of capital they allow in. It's exactly in this very productive manufacturing, those kind of sectors. And as they grow, and they realize that their needs are different now, they start expanding the set of allowable investments and allowable industries, right? And so they're running this sort of policy, whatever industrial policy, whatever you want to call it, domestically. But in terms of what we are talking about, the macro-financial dealing with the external world, it's a very deliberative thing. Somebody's making these decisions domestically, right? So there is a body behind it. That's what I mean. Those bureaucratic structures need to be built in, and in a way that get balanced with the political process,
So, in a lot of what we've been discussing, the issue of discipline, restraint, is a big feature.
It's all the things we teach our children, you know? It's like nothing is different at the collective level.
Except it's also one of the most difficult things,
Yeah.
no? So, to what extent, I mean, you know, I think we tend to overlook also, like countries like Vietnam, China, the political structure behind the ability to enforce this restraint, but also the fact that they are quite advanced in the demographic transition, unlike many countries in sub-Saharan Africa,
Yeah.
for example. You know, in sub-Saharan Africa, domestic savings is limited, including because, you know, you have the size of the working age population is very small relative to, you know, dependency ratio is very high. So do you consider kind of those kind of deeper factors as an explanatory variable in terms of why the particular reliance on foreign savings take place, or do you see a scope? Of course, a counter argument would be China, Vietnam,
Yeah.
you know, when they were going through this demographic transition, never really relied on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's very important that one is careful in separating correlation from causation in some of these deeper questions, precisely because you can get, like when one thinks about, okay, Vietnam is doing well, China, oh, well, wait a second, they have something in common. You know, it's a one-party rule and all of that. So is that what you need to be more authoritarian? And I think it's very important that we put those kind of deeper questions to an actual test and say, is that true? And people have done work, you know, Lerona Simoglu has done some good work on that. And we need to be clear on that question. The answer is no. Authoritarian rule by and large on average, because for every Vietnam you have a Venezuela as well. And for every South Korea, you have a North Korea. Mm-hmm. So I think we do have examples like Japan and South Korea and others. Malaysia and Indonesia is doing well and all of that. And when you put all of that together, democracy is, on the balance, good for growth. That's good news, because I think it has positive implications for how, as a society, we arrange ourselves, and we like to give individual freedoms and independence, as we should. But we still need to regulate ourselves, despite giving ourselves those freedoms and so on. And so that's the thing I think it's important that we frame it the right way. Because I do believe in first principles very strongly, and I think the principle of individual right. It's very important. I want to just to be sure that when we are talking about Africa, when we are talking about the promise of Africa, when we are talking about what it can achieve in GDP terms, why are we doing all of this? It's like what you said in the beginning, that, you know, the life expectancy is going up and so on, but it's about the quality of life.
Absolutely.
It's about the enrichment of life. And I think it is important to highlight that when we talk about the quality and the enrichment of life, it is not just about bricks and mortars. A very important attribute is individual freedoms, individual dignity, the due process of law, and so on. So I very much incorporate all of that as part and parcel of what development should be, and it very much is. And so in the same spirit, although that's off topic, of course, so when we talk about building these institutions to guarantee certain behavior, of course you need those, and that's about the courts and so on. So I think that's part of the, but I think it's important that when we talk about that, we do give this message that this is what we mean by development and growth. To be inclusive. You know, we haven't really talked about the distributional issues yet, but that's another very important dimension. That we do it in ways, because if it's inclusive, it's more likely to be sustainable. Precisely because of the very first question you raised, which is again about the political myopia and things like that. We know quite well that the more skewed the sharing of growth is, the more likely it is that you will end up in problems politically that will derail the whole process. So it's important to be able to grow in a more inclusive way. So when people see that they have a bite in the system, they themselves want to protect the system. And the opposite is also true.
Of course, yeah. Of course. Maybe this is a good time to ask the question on inclusivity that I had for you. I mean, one clear failure, it strikes me, in many developing countries, including in sub-Saharan Africa, is not taxing the wealthy enough.
Yes.
Of course, this is true for many countries. We're not unique in that sense. But, still kind of in the really very boisterous democracies that we have in the region, there's been inadequate revenue mobilization, particularly with an emphasis on getting more resources from richer segments of society. Do you see this as a political issue or more of a technical issue, not having identified the right instruments?
Both. It's a very excellent question, really, because the political one is obvious. It is a political, because it's like you're asking the rich to tax themselves because they have a lot of power in making those kind of decisions. So it's definitely a political issue. But I think it's also a technical issue. And the reason I say that is because it very often is only codified in terms of dollars and cents, that we need to raise X billion dollars, where do we raise it from? But I think it's important to dig a little deeper into that question on the technical side. I think that clarifies the issue. And then what you realize is that it's not just about taxing the wealthy, but it's also about taxing the right kind of activity and not taxing the other kind. So what do I mean by that? And I always like to give this example because it goes back to this whole philosophical thinking, Henry George and so on, force forward, which is there are certain kind of activity and assets that you can tax much more efficiently in the economic sense of the word efficient. And it doesn't have as much deadweight loss, which is like land is the classic example because nobody creates land. It's there, it will be there no matter what you do. But some land is more valuable because now it happens to be in the center of a city and things of that nature. But the value that land represents is really the collective work that is happening in the city. It's not whoever happened to own it historically is not relevant. So I'm just giving that as an example to say, look, there's certain kind of taxation which is more efficient. It's more efficient to tax land because by taxing it, you're not distorting. If I'm doing a lot of work to create something new, to innovate and so on, and you start taxing me heavily, I mean, there's a bit, you don't want to tax. So, and again, it starts impinging on. So you see, there is a balance between this sort of the conservative viewpoint, if you will, and the liberal viewpoint on this. And I think we need to strike that balance. And there's a technical question there in the middle of it, which is we can, which will actually appeal to both sides on it because they will say yes. Because what's the conservative argument against taxation? The conservative argument against or too much taxation is that you should not take too much of an individual's own fruit, the fruit of their labor. That's exactly right.
Disincentivize activity.
Exactly, and that's exactly right. But then now think of what I just said on the sort of the technical argument is that there are certain set of activities and assets and so on that are not really a function of how much effort you put in. So there will be more of an agreement on taxing that kind of an activity. So first, on the politically, when you pitch the issue that way, you'll have more cohesion. Because ideologically differing views will also, this is the right one actually, we get it, let's tax this one, that's number one. The other benefit you have by thinking on these kind of technical issues is that not only are you likely to get more of a political alignment on getting these things through, but now that you're taxing more efficiently, it will have growth incentives as well. Because it's very important to think of taxation not only as a revenue-raising activity, but tax also does something else, which is it is a way you can incentivize your population on what to do and what not to do. Like you can tax smoking and things, that's sort of this, or pollution, right? So that's the other thing that taxation is doing. So I think what we can tax the less productive sectors more aggressively, we can tax the more productive sectors less aggressively, and so on. And when you start going in that direction, that's another sort of the thread of my recent research is exactly on these kind of issues. You start to come up with this obvious idea, again on a technical, but it has very deep social and political implications, is this taxation of wealth versus labor, right? And so I think we need to go a little easier on taxing people's labor and a bit more aggressive on taxing things like land and so on, and accumulation of wealth that is beyond what is healthy for a society. That's a whole different dimension. Again, that that we can get into. But that is the sort of the deliberative process that, again, going back to the kind of institutions that we are talking about, these countries, all of this will be discussed there. And then it will be discussed in parliament, but they need to be making those decisions.
I want to ask one question, at least on this issue of taxation of wealth. I've heard a podcast or two where you've raised the very distortive focus on real estate in Pakistan, your home country, for example.
Yeah.
So that's one obvious area where you can have a way of taxing a clearly non-tradable investment, which is not helping the economy and shifting incentives to the right way. Any other examples of areas where governments could focus on to generate taxes and incentivize activity in the right direction?
Yeah, I think, and so here, let me now appeal to some of the conversations that have been happening in the US about wealth taxes in particular. I think it makes a lot of sense. And there it's no longer just about real estate, but it's about another dimension of excessive wealth, which is something I've done, work with Ludwig Straub at Harvard and Amr Sufi at Chicago, where we sort of, talk about why too much wealth can be disruptive for the macroeconomy. Because what is wealth? Wealth is someone's accumulation of their past savings. And we typically think that as you're accumulating those savings are going back into the economy as a real investment, which then leads to growth. That's the good side of savings. And that's true. If that's happening, then you don't want to sort of touch it. But when you look at the data, once again, it's all about the data, not about what you and I think. When you look at the data, the reality is that the increase in wealth in the top 1%, on the margin, as we say in technical terms, the incremental wealth is not going into real investments at all. What instead it is doing what I generally refer to as financialization of the economy. That additional saving is going into lending to households and governments for consumption expenditure. That's a very different kind of saving, and it's actually not beneficial. It's actually hurtful in the long run because you're creating indebted demand. That's the title of one of the papers we wrote about this. And that, for various reasons that we probably don't want to get into right now, is actually not healthy in the long run because it leads to kind of these secular stagnation kind of forces, fall in demand, fall in interest rates, and it's not healthy. It's not a healthy way to live. And so there is this whole second kind of arguments that when you reach that level of excessive wealth accumulation, and I just want to be very clear, I'm not talking about taxing wealth of the middle class or upper middle class. I'm talking about it's become a little obscene how concentrated levels of wealth have become at the very top. And we need to do something about it. And I'm not making a moral argument here, even though there is, I think, a good moral argument there as well. I'm making a technical economic argument for the collective, that it is not in our collective self-interest as a society, as an economy, as a macroeconomy, if you will, that you have these extreme levels of wealth accumulation, because that has negative implications. I just tried to give you some intuition for why that is the case. And so it is logical and rational, in my view, to do something about it by appealing to taxing those excessive accumulation of savings in the form of extreme wealth concentration. I think it's a very important question. I think it's also a question, by the way, that requires global coordination. Mm-hmm. There's already, and it's very healthy. You see, we human beings, there's a positive to us as a collective as well. I think that's where the hope is. That's why this is so important, that we have institutions like the one you're sitting in, that we talk about these collective problems. And we talk about that we can do this. It's a slow-mo, I know it's a grind. But I think it's very important that we do, because, again, ultimately it's people's lives that matter, and that's what we are trying to do here. But there has been recent movement, like, on corporate taxes and so on, so minimum global corporate taxes and so on. The US has pushed it, and other countries have followed suit and so on. We need more of that leadership on global coordination, on the wealth dimension as well, for obvious reasons. So I think all of these issues are very important. But again, bringing it back to the development experience and what it means for Africa, I think it all fundamentally goes back to understand these nuances.
Absolutely.
And then develop your domestic capacities. That's sort of, I think, really the core message at the end of it.
Atif, I wish we had more time to hear more from you. Brilliant conversation. Really wonderful, nuanced ideas. Really, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Abebe. It has been a pleasure. I was so excited that you invited me, really, because I really wanted to talk about Africa.
I can feel
and
the enthusiasm.
And the hope it really represents for all of us.
Absolutely. And I hope we can do more work together going forward. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all also for joining us today. Look forward to talking to you. Look forward to presenting to you another Africa Perspective episode in a few weeks. Thank you so much.